Welcome to Budgets and the Law, a module of the Budgets and Finance course of the endorsement program of the State Library of Iowa. This course is not meant to substitute as legal advice. Rather, it is simply conveying information about various laws that pertain to the financial and budgetary processes of your library. My name is Mary Ann Morey. I'm the consultant for the Central District with the State Library of Iowa. This module will examine various state and local laws that pertain to the library's financial management. This module does build upon information you received in the module titled Free Libraries Aren't Free, in which we discuss the roles of the library team. If you haven't yet viewed that module, I encourage you to complete it before viewing this one. In this module, we'll spend time looking at the laws that pertain to the director's interaction with your budget, the board's oversight of your budget, and the city's involvement with your budget. We'll also examine how these laws determine your library's policies and procedures concerning its finances. Regarding that last objective, we will be looking at that as we go along throughout the course of this module by making practical applications of the information. So let's begin by doing a review of the director's role pertaining to budgetary aspects. The library has a very long list of duties pertaining to the budget team, and it is the director who is working with that library budget on a practically daily basis. Because of that, here are some basic duties of the director. Drafting the annual budget each year, which the board then approves. Making the purchases, managing the spending, and pacing the spending throughout the year. Assuming the city clerk is providing monthly financial reports to the director then should be including those reports for the board at each monthly meeting. Understanding the fact that the city must be accountable for the use of public funds, which warrants the director being accountable as well. Library directors should have a good grasp on the library's budget since they will need to report financial information on the state-required annual survey. Many directors also write grants for their libraries. While a director doesn't need a degree in accounting, having a good grasp of basic math skills, as well as a basic understanding of budgeting and record keeping or bookkeeping, certainly does come in handy for directors. So, what kinds of laws might affect the director's interaction with the budget? While there really aren't any budgetary laws that specifically mention library director by name, these laws definitely apply to budgetary situations in which library directors may find themselves. Some of these laws will be reviews for you, assuming you have completed the library laws course, but maybe you'll now see how those laws directly apply to specific library situations. It's always good to take what we've learned and make practical application from it, to put it into practice and use the knowledge in a way that causes us to act appropriately. You may recall this slide from our Laws for Libraries module, part of the Library Law course. Article 3, Section 31 of the Constitution of Iowa says in part that no public money or property shall be appropriated for local or private purposes. This seems like a simple mandate to obey, but we have seen well-meaning librarians violate this section, thereby putting themselves and their library and city at risk. Our state law librarian says this: state law and accounting standards place restrictions on what trustees and library directors can do with public funds, property, and resources they've been entrusted to spend or use for the community's benefit. Even the equipment in the library and the staff's time belong to taxpayers. And once library staff accept something from the public, whether it's money or a donated book, it becomes city property, subject to myriad rules. It's important to understand this concept. Public officials have gone to prison for failing to carry out this duty. Some librarians innocently do illegal things, but ignorance is no excuse for breaking the law. Closely related to that section of the Constitution is this Iowa Code, Section 721.2, which is entitled Non-Felonious Misconduct in Office. Subsection 5 says that it is illegal for a public employee to permit any person to use public property for any private purpose and for personal gain. The Iowa Supreme Court, in its 1930 decision, Love versus the City of Des Moines, said that public money can be spent only for public purposes. The public purposes must be apparent at first blush and documentable. The harder it is to document an expenditure's public purpose, the less likely there is a public purpose. If an expenditure doesn't have a public purpose, the public should not be paying for it. So let's look at what all of this means in practice. Librarians cannot share book job discounts with their friends group or staff members, or split an Amazon Prime membership with patrons, or share the library's sales tax exemption. This means your staff cannot take advantage of the library's discounts to order books as gifts. It also means that your friends group cannot purchase books for the library by utilizing the library's discounts. Hear me again, not even your friends group, who may be purchasing books for your library, can purchase those books through the library's discounts with its book vendors. You will need to have the library order the books, and the friends group can then submit a check to the city for the amount of the order, and the city will pay the bill as usual by using the funds donated by the friends. Next, the library's financial privileges cannot be conveyed. If a patron donates money to the library, it cannot be handed over to the friends or the foundation, even if it's a massive bequest. Donations given directly to the friends or foundation group obviously stay with those groups. The library cannot donate library funds to a local scholarship fund or give money to a community foundation. Additionally, you cannot use library funds to purchase gifts for staff or trustees. Worn-out computers cannot be given to a favorite patron who refurbishes them, even if he donates them to a nonprofit organization. There are very strict laws and rules governing the uses of public funding and property. Also, you can't allow special privileges, such as making photocopies without payment, to be extended to yourself, staff, trustees, or other persons closely affiliated with the library. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of prohibitions that pertain to the sections of the state constitution and Iowa code we just looked at, but it does give you some considerations of ways that seemingly innocent actions may in reality be a flagrant disregard for established law. As the old saying goes, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Iowa Code Section 384.3 states that all money received for city governmental purposes from taxes and other sources must be credited to the general fund of the city, except those monies received for the purposes of trust and agency funds. This is interpreted basically to a use it or lose it concept. According to our trustees handbook, funds remaining in the library account at the end of the year will revert unless the city has given authority to the library board to carry over the funds in the library account, or unless the funds are designated to a specific account. These types of specific accounts are often commonly referred to as trust accounts. There are two types of specific accounts: permanent accounts, meaning the library can only spend the interest on the funds, and special revenue funds, meaning the library is allowed to spend the entire amount in the account. Our trustees handbook explains more about these accounts as follows. If the library has plans for year-end funds, the board should request that the city council pass a resolution to authorize carryover of the fund balance or establish either of the above accounts. The resolution should indicate, among other things, the title of the account, the purpose of the account, and whether the interest on the fund is to be added to the account. The city council then passes a resolution establishing these accounts to accumulate funds for a planned purpose or project. Note that these accounts are no longer officially referred to as trust accounts, but that is still a commonly used general name for these specific accounts, which you may come across in your city. The basis for this name change is Government Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, Statement Number 34 from June 1999 that took effect in either 2001 or 2002, depending upon your city's level of revenue. We sometimes hear from library directors and boards who say they don't want to report donations to their city because they think the city will take the library's donations and use them for the city's own purposes, say to fill potholes or something like that. Our state law librarian will warn you against this action, and I'm quoting from her in this next paragraph. Even if you're afraid the City Council will keep some of the cash the library takes in, it is incumbent upon the director to accurately report all revenue and expenditures despite potential consequences. To do otherwise is a crime, and not just in a figurative sense. We're talking about a felony. Sometimes librarians ask if it's illegal to hold on to a June check from the county, for instance, until July because there isn't time to spend it before July 1st, which means the city will likely divert it to the general fund. The state auditor staff says, don't do it. If the check from the county or elsewhere is expected in June, then it should have been accounted for in the budget for the current fiscal year, which allows you to have spent it at any point in that fiscal year between last July 1st and this June 30th. If the library's director and trustees are uncomfortable receiving the county's check in June, then it's time to talk to the county about issuing the check at a different time. If the county can't issue the check a few weeks later or maybe earlier, then it's time to talk to the city about possibly holding the money for the next fiscal year. Again, if the city says no, there's not much you can do except attempt to accurately account for it and spend it in the current fiscal year. A slightly similar situation is when directors realize they have some extra funds at the end of the fiscal year and determine to spend down those funds by prepaying for services or expenditures they'll incur in the new fiscal year. Again, I'm quoting from our state law library here. The state auditor's office says a city cannot prepay for goods not received or services not yet rendered, so such claims should not be paid until the goods or services have been received. Payment in advance would not guarantee receipt of the goods or services, thereby putting public funds at risk. Article 7, Section 1 of the Constitution of Iowa says, "The credit of the state shall not in any manner be given or loaned to, or in aid of, any individual, association, or corporation." A formal Iowa Attorney General's opinion dated July 12, 1979, confirms the state auditor's interpretation and judgment and further extends the definition of state to include any governmental subdivision such as a city. Remember that since the library is a city department, this law applies to you. Our law librarian goes on to say it is inappropriate, unethical, and against generally accepted accounting standards to use current fiscal year funds to pay for services to be received in an upcoming fiscal year. Auditors will look for compliance with something called the matching principle, which states that expenses have to be matched with revenues as long as it is reasonable to do so. Expenses are recognized not when the work is performed or when a product is produced, but when the work or the product actually makes its contribution to revenue. Only if no connection with revenue can be established can you charge costs as expenses to the current fiscal year, for example, office salaries and other administrative expenses. This principle allows a more accurate evaluation of actual financial performance. Encumbrances, on the other hand, are purchase orders or contracts entered into before the end of the fiscal year for goods or services not yet received. For example, a book ordered for the library in June, but not delivered until after July 1st, would be an encumbered obligation. The funds set aside in the budget for the book would carry over to the next fiscal year because the obligation for the order was encumbered or made before the end of the fiscal year. We've often had libraries attempt to do this with Bridges, the statewide ebook consortium. Bills would go out just at the end of the fiscal year, and the bill was actually for services incurred in the upcoming fiscal year. Some libraries would try to sneak a payment in the current fiscal year if they had a bit of windfall, rather than waiting until the July calendar and paying the invoice in the appropriate fiscal year. This is not an acceptable practice, so don't do it. Here's another law that directors should be aware of. Public employees must be wary of accepting gifts. Iowa Code Section 68B.22 states, "Except as otherwise provided in this section, a public official, public employee, or candidate, or that person's immediate family member shall not directly or indirectly accept or receive any gift or series of gifts from a restricted donor." The code goes on to list certain exceptions. For instance, subsection H includes plaques or items of negligible resale value, which are given as recognition for public services. And subsection J includes non-monetary items with a value of $3 or less that are received from any one donor during one calendar day. As a general rule of thumb, librarians are advised not to accept gifts valued at more than $3. If a patron brings you a huge platter of cookies during the holiday season, share it with all your staff rather than claiming it for yourself. If a vendor includes a tote bag valued at $9.99 as a thank you gift for your library order, put it in your library's summer prize package. Do not keep it for yourself. Let's look at how laws may affect the library board's role in budgetary considerations. Boards, as you should recall from other courses, have a great deal of authority over the library's budget. Although the city allocates money to the library, it is the board's authority to set up the annual budget with the line items and to approve monthly bills. Boards also need to understand that there are state laws, which we'll look at in a moment, regarding accountability of public funds. Library boards need to remember that cities must account for all public dollars, and we'll look at that requirement when we focus on the city's legal requirements regarding your budget. If you watched the first module in this budget course, you should recall that the Iowa Trustees Handbook clearly says the state library recommends that the city do the financial accounting, write checks for the library's expenditures after authorization by the board, and submit monthly financial reports to the board. The Iowa League of Cities and the State Auditor's Office will advise you likewise. This means that no library trustees should be writing checks from a library account to pay the library's bills. You are putting your library board in a very liable situation if you are asking a trustee to be responsible for writing checks and managing payroll. Iowa Code Section 384.20 is widely interpreted to indicate that the city should perform all the financial tasks for each of its agencies. The library most definitely is a city agency and part of the city government as long as it receives an appropriation from the general fund. From a legal standpoint, it is best to let the city absorb the liability for financial transactions, especially payroll. If the trustees pay the bills and payroll, the individual trustees can be sued. If the city pays the bills and payroll, the city absorbs the legal responsibility. The Iowa League of Cities and most city attorneys insist that the city handle all financial transactions for its agencies, including the payroll, in order to reduce the city's legal liabilities. According to your library's ordinance, your board should have control of the expenditures of all funds allocated for library purposes by the council and of all other monies belonging to the library. If you will recall from other modules and courses, this authority is given to the library board not only by the local ordinance, but also by state code. Iowa Code Section 392.5 specifically authorizes public library boards in Iowa to accept and control expenditure of all gifts, devices, and bequests to the library. Even though the city council can't directly control how the library's trustees use the library's budgeted monies, the library board still has a fiduciary responsibility to use public funds wisely and in compliance with applicable laws, regulations, contracts, etc. All of this means that your library board should be reviewing and approving your library's bills for payments. Such approval should be done within the context of an open meeting. Once the board approves the bills, you should give them to your city clerk or finance officer if you have one for payment. In the event of bad weather or, as recently experienced, a global pandemic, library boards may meet remotely for this approval of the bills. However, approving bills by email is never a legally accepted way to approve the library's bills or to make any other decision regarding the library. Meeting in an online environment that the public can view, such as a Zoom room or Facebook Live setting, does meet the legal requirements of an open meeting, although in normal, non-pandemic times, you still need a physical location in addition to the online or remote meeting option. Email, as I said, is never an option for fulfilling open meeting requirements. Although trustees have authority over the library's budget and the city council can't control the use of those library funds, this does not mean the library board can do just anything at once with those funds. State law and accounting standards do place some restrictions on what trustees can do with the public funds they've been entrusted to spend for the community's benefit. Perhaps first and foremost, the board, the director, the library's employees, and its volunteers must vigilantly ensure that public funds and public property are not transferred to private interests. Our state constitution, state laws, court decisions, and attorney general's opinions prohibit such transfers. Please contact our state law library if you have additional questions or concerns about this topic. Your library's ordinance likely includes a section such as you see on this sample ordinance taken from our website. In most all cases, Iowa Public Library boards are empowered to authorize use of the library by residents of another town that needs to contract for its library services. A question the state library often fields is, how do you determine a contracting amount? I once took a phone call from a library director who had questions about a current contract her library had with a neighboring town. She told me the amount that the other town was paying for its contracted services. I quickly looked online to see the town's population, and I did some basic fourth grade level math and realized that the contracting town was paying a grand total of 17 cents per capita to this library for its annual use. 17 cents per capita. Is that a good price? Well, perhaps it's good for the contracting city, but it's certainly not good for the library. Here are some simple step-by-step instructions I've previously shared with libraries asking about contracting. First, you want to know what your own citizens are paying for library services. Use your city's per capita amount for the contracting city as a starting point, so you will need to know the population of the other city. Review A-sized libraries' per capita information from the state library statistics, since presumably the other city has a population of 500 or less, which would put them in the A-size category. Choose samples of libraries with similar populations and average the per capita amount, and then determine a fair and equitable amount based upon all of the above information and circumstances. So for example, if your city is paying $41.50 per capita and all of the A-size libraries are paying an average of $31 per capita, and then the average of smaller sized A libraries equals $12.75 per capita, then a possible contracting amount for the city who wants to contract with you could be anywhere between $12.75 and $31. Let's look now at the city's role and budgetary aspects. Remember that cities hold the purse strings. Cities determine the amount of city tax dollars that they allocate to the library's budget. This slide reminds us of all that the city does regarding budgets and financing of the library. We noted earlier that the library board has the authority to approve the library's bills and expenditures. However, your city will likely go through the process of having those bills approved. In reality, the city is actually only acknowledging payment of those bills. This is how our state library staff has explained it. According to the Iowa League of Cities, this is how the matter is addressed in the city clerk's manual produced by the league. And I'm quoting from that manual. After the board approves library bills in the general operation of the library director should coordinate information with the city finance officer to ensure the bills are added to the list of claims provided to the city council and published. This ensures that the expenditures are published in accordance with requirements in the Iowa Code and that the general ledger is kept current. While this is not mandated, both the auditor of the state and the State Library of Iowa encourage this preferred method. As with any other department, the library cannot spend more than has been allocated unless the budget is formally amended. Accordingly, the library and the city must work together to determine whether a formal budget amendment is required to account for possible expenditure overages or unanticipated revenues. It is often beneficial for the city council to receive a monthly or quarterly financial report from the library board to help ensure the library's budget is fiscally sound. So that seems to be the real reason that the city council sort of affirms the library's expenditures, not necessarily to approve their payment, but to formally acknowledge that certain funds have been spent. If you find that your library has unexpected funds or unexpected bills at the end of the fiscal year that weren't part of the originally approved budget, you'll need to amend your budget. This is something your city has to do. And what is an amended budget and what might that have to do with the library's budget? Iowa Code Section 384.18 is entitled Budget Amendment and says a city budget for the current fiscal year must be formally amended or changed in the same manner as the original budget by May 31st for any of these reasons: to allow the appropriation and expenditure of unanticipated, unencumbered cash balances on hand, the unanticipated receipt of non-taxpayer funds, or transfers between programs within the general fund. The state auditor's staff wants our agency to remind librarians that even if the library's ordinance says that all revenue received by the library is for the library to spend, it's still up to the city to decide what the library gets to keep above and beyond that which was budgeted as expected revenue. So when you get a big windfall, or you collect more fines and fees than expected and accounted for in the budget, the director and or the trustees have to ask the city, very nicely of course, if the library can keep those funds and either spend them in the current fiscal year or save them for the next. The city is well within its rights to say, no, you have to turn those over to the general fund. While this is rarely done with bequests or memorials, because the public relations would be disastrous for the city and, in the case of a bequest, would likely conflict with the will of the deceased, it is done fairly often with excess fines and fees. The state auditor staff emphasizes that more often than not, it pays dividends, literally, for the library director and the library's trustees to always and forever make nice with the city's administrators, the mayor, and the city council. Librarians often ask about getting rid of old electronics, equipment, furniture, and other real property. Ideally, your city government has a policy, program, and procedure for recycling or disposing of its own electronic trash and property. Check with your city clerk or city manager. Alternatively, your city may have a surplus procedure by which city agencies must surplus all property no longer wanted or needed. Either one of those programs would relieve you of the burden and liability of deciding what to do with those items. Most city, county, and state governments have strict procedures in place for handling expired city property that include, among other things, removing said property from the government's inventory and insurance rolls, and ensuring that something shed by one agency cannot be used by another agency, even if it requires repair or reconditioning. The issue of who is responsible to take care of the library building is a huge one. We consultants are asked this question or similar ones a lot. I'm going to again refer to and quote from our state law library for answers. According to both the State Auditor's Division of Municipal Finances and the Iowa League of Cities, the relationship between library boards and city councils is complicated with regard to capital improvements, capital projects, and maintenance costs such as utilities. There isn't one correct way to handle such funding requests or demands depending upon the urgency of the request. Each approach requires frequent, thorough, and if possible, respectful and cooperative communication between the library's trustees and the city council members. Public library buildings belong to their cities. The city is legally responsible for ensuring the library's property and its contents, for maintaining the safety of the building and grounds, for providing workers' compensation insurance in case staff gets injured on the premises, for all major repairs, and for the replacement of faulty building equipment such as furnaces. If the library's roof caves in on visiting patrons, the lawsuits get filed against the city, not against the library and not against the trustees or staff. City councils have vested interests in working with library boards to ensure the soundness of library buildings in order to minimize risks and liabilities. When the library board presents its annual budget request to the city, there are typically line item budgets that add up to the total budget request. If capital improvements, such as tuck pointing, for example, capital projects, such as a new roof, maintenance, such as snow removal, lawn care, and janitorial services, and utilities, such as heating, cooling, water, etc., are included as line items, the library board and the city council obviously have a mutual understanding that the library is budgeting for its own building needs. If the library's budget does not include those line items, the city is obviously not appropriating money for them directly to the library, and council members shouldn't be surprised when a special request for the library's new roof comes up. At this point, if the council insists that the cost of a new roof comes out of the library's appropriations for staff, materials, equipment, and supplies, council members are well aware that library services to their constituents will be compromised. So politics alone can typically keep the conversation flowing. Officials with both the League and the Auditor's Office agree that good communication between library boards and city councils prevents conflicts of responsibilities from covering the costs or for covering the costs of building and property maintenance and improvements. This state law applies to every incorporated city and every county. Iowa Code Section 256.69 is the section that requires these entities to provide financial support to the public library. You may recall having seen this slide in other endorsement classes. You may also recall that we said elsewhere that this amount is outdated and incapable of adequately funding any library. However, the spirit of the law is that your city is required to fund the public library. As stated at the beginning of this module is not intended to be an exhaustive list of the laws that pertain to library budgets and fiduciary matters. It is also not intended to be considered as legal advice. Always contact an attorney for legal advice. This module is designed to help you realize common library budget situations that are affected by law. Contact your district consultant or the state library's law library if you have additional questions. This concludes our module about budgets and the law.